have immortalized on in a digital form. But at the same time, we'll be able to go back and recreate and replay. And one of the things that I think we'll want to do in terms of recreating and replaying is a presentation from Mr. Bjorn Bergman. As you saw in the agenda, he is with SkyTruth, and I think I'll just let it go at that, saying he's obviously a very insightful analyst and has done a lot of interesting work. And I will turn it over to him for his presentation. And Bjorn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dana. It's great to have the opportunity to present here. My connection's occasionally a little bit unstable, so just let me know if I'm not coming through, and I can try and reconnect. So I've been working with AIS tracking data, tracking ships over the past 5 years. And just relatively recently, at the end of last year, I started looking more at cases where actual manipulation of GPS signals is involved. So it's a new topic for me, but it's been really interesting. And I'm going to show some of the things I've found recently, and then I'm also very interested to get your expert opinions on what may be going on in some of these cases. So I'm going to share a screen with a presentation. Okay, so you should all be seeing the presentation on the screen. So I'm an analyst with SkyTruth. This is a nonprofit based in West Virginia that does environmental analysis investigations using satellite data. But I've mostly been involved with a program called Global Fishing Watch, which is now also an independent organization. And the objective was to make global activity from fishing visible to the public for the first time. And that is dependent on a tracking data from AIS. So this is a system where ships out at sea put out their location, speed, and course every few seconds. And nearby vessels, several miles away, will pick up these locations and be able to adjust their course to avoid any safety issues. But over the past several years, for the first time, different companies started putting up satellites, which are also collecting this data. There's been a rapid increase in the amount of the data. So we had only 3 satellites in 2012. Now we're having more than 60. And this means that we have much greater precision with the data that we can work with. So here you can see all of the ships, about 300,000 operating in a year for the whole world with AIS tracks. You can see clearly. Global Fishing Watch was actually to pull out just the fishing activity. So you can see that here. We do this based on algorithms for detecting specific types of movement. But something that came up as we were doing this work is that there are also, first of all, we noticed fishing boats that were broadcasting false locations in the AIS system. This is the first example I noticed where we have a track in red, which is the broadcast AIS location. It appeared southeast of New Zealand and then actually going down over Antarctica. So it was obviously not the real location of the ship. And I could just see visually that it fit against the coast of South America. So based on that, we started to investigate a whole set of ships And what we found was a standard pattern of offsetting of locations. And keep in mind, this is just in the AIS system. And AIS data, it's a huge global tracking system. It's relatively open. The data is messy and not secure. And this sort of thing is really just someone somehow manipulating their AIS device, and does not have anything to do with the underlying navigation positions from GPS that AIS is picking up. There's some other way that the vessel is doing this. So over the past few months, though, I started just doing a survey of all of the cases where we system, and what would be the cause of these. And I ran across this article coming out last year about an American ship entering port in Shanghai. And, as they were going down the Huangpu River into the city, they noticed that the positions on their plotter all of a sudden were, not making any sense, not only for the vessel itself, but for surrounding vessels. So I started looking into the location that was identified by the article. And this is what we found. So the vessel is entering the area within a kilometer or so of this location. Their position jumps to a ring onshore. You can see closer up here. So the positions of an individual vessel are in yellow, and then all of the other affected positions are in red. This is a ring about 200 meters in diameter, and all around this central location. And one interesting thing to point out, and important, is that this is not simply an error in the ship's AIS system, because it was also possible to see that this was also affecting other AIS tracking. So this is a map from Strava with different fitness trackers. It may be a little bit hard to see, but there's a similar ring showing up. So somehow there is manipulation of the GPS tracking for these ships, which is coming out in the AIS system, which is the data we're looking at. So I started looking where else this is happening. It was a pretty specific pattern with these rings of positions. And it turned out it was happening in 6 Chinese cities. Mostly this has been associated with oil terminals. But you can also see that certain government installations as well. This is the Qingdao Tax Authority. So again, what you're seeing is that a vessel which is nearby, instead of putting out its real location on AIS, for whatever reason, that location is being moved, so it's in orbit of this building in this case. And we can look a little bit closer at what's happening in at oil terminals in particular. So here we're seeing a oil terminal in Dalian, China. And in this case, we had several different locations where we were seeing GPS interference. Those are marked with in orange here on the left. But this is looking at a day before the interference started. This is March 1st, 2019. And you see more or less what we would expect from AIS. These clusters of vessels are probably tankers is their unloading their product. So what do we see once the GPS interference is active? This is the same location from September 5th. And you can see that, 2 of these locations actually have the these circles where the positions are being scrambled. And so you can see a big difference also just in all the vessels in the vicinity, because it appears to affect anything within a few kilometers of these locations on shore. So we don't know exactly why these devices are being deployed, but it does clearly have an effect on tracking shipping in any way. So, with positions here, it would be relatively easy to identify the different tankers that have come into port to offload their, the crude oil for the refinery here. But once this this GPS interference is occurring, everything is scrambled, and it would be very difficult to make that identification. So I'm going to stop here and just, are there any questions on that, that first case there? We're seeing cases of GPS interference in 6 cities on the Chinese coast. We're picking this up from AIS, but it's also confirmed that this is not just a problem with ship tracking systems. It's in the basic GPS positioning itself, because we see it. I also checked recently, and this is ongoing in 4 of the locations. Let's see, any questions on that?
Yeah, this is Marty Faggett. How do you know the position of the ship when the AIS is incorrect? What other data tells you where it is?
Yeah, in this case, we're not sure, because it's a relatively close shift in the position. So we're just talking about a couple kilometers. We know, of course, that the ship cannot be on land. So we know that the positions that are actually broadcast by AIS are false. And, we can guess that the ship, went into this anchorage and then left, because we then see it, a few days later leaving the area. And once it's a few kilometers away, we have a normal track again. In the next examples that I'm going to show.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ian McCall, it looked as though there were more ships after the trouble started, not just in the wrong place. It looked like there were a bunch of ships added as well. Was that true?
Yeah, so what I'm showing in those graphics are the individual GPS positions. So we have a position coming through every minute or so. And so it's looking like it's more ships, because instead of seeing the clusters that we would have if a position is at dock and just broadcasting their position again and again in the same location, the interference, these circles, so some of the positions are appearing within the circles, and some are just appearing scattered around in the area. So that's why it looks like there are a lot more ships.
Well, on AI, the person on the ship sort of put in any location they want, or is it pretty secure?
Yeah, so I would say generally that the AIS system on ships is not secure, and it clearly has been manipulated, like some of the examples I showed earlier with the fishing boat tracks. But that was not anything going on with GPS. This is particularly interesting because we.
Oh, okay.
Oh, kind of lost you, Bjorn. Are you still there?
Okay, thanks.
Hopefully while Bjorn gets his connection. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. Am I still coming through?
Bjorn, I have a
Yes.
question. Any tanker that's anchored is going to run a plot with their chart plotter on, an anchorage to make sure they're not drifting. Are you saying that that data that's going to their AIS is being manipulated? I mean, has anyone complained that their anchor swing is not being correct? I mean, I'm trying to get an idea of how the AIS stuff is really being manipulated.
Yeah. So with AIS, so the ship is constantly has this. If you're in the bridge of a ship, you'll see that the GPS location is displayed on either the map plotter or the ship will just have it there. But it's that actual GPS information, the latitude and longitude on the ship that's somehow being falsified, and it's not. As soon as these vessels approach within a couple kilometers of a point on shore where we presume that some sort of interference device has been activated.
Yeah,
So you're saying a ship at anchor has no idea what their true position is?
Yes, that was the case whenever any of these ships entered within this radius.
All right, can we trace back any actual complaints from those tanker captains that this was occurring, or is this all from AIS data?
Yeah, so there was this initial report by an American captain in the port of Shanghai, and that prompted this first article, the MIT Tech Review. Based on that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so so there certainly was that report. We'd also, when I was still working in the maritime navigator role with Coast Guard, we would get a lot of unofficial anecdotal reports about these kinds of disruptions. But when we asked for formal reports so we could follow up on them, we were all told, always without exception told, no, we have to do business in X place. And so we really don't want to rock the boat. Quite literally. So we just thought you ought to know, but we don't want to make any formal kind of complaint. So definitely folks know had known this is happening to them, but it's a very rare occasion, as what we saw in the Black Sea, and then the one in Shanghai, where folks will actually come out and say something in public, because there are a lot of incentives to not do that.
Leon, it's Leon Lobo from NPL. Just is there any reason why it's such a defined a spoofing effectively rather than something more arbitrary or random to make it less obvious?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, why we're seeing these particular rings, which are relatively easy to identify. I assume it's some artifact of the interference device. But I will share with you a few other examples that I've seen recently where we have somewhat different phenomenon, although some similar rings that we're seeing with AIS. And again, AIS, I guess, is just useful because it's sort of a global record of ships all over the world, where we have a huge data set where these positions that are received from GPS and then rebroadcast and picked up by satellites are recorded. So it works pretty well to be able to pick out locations where there seems to be some sort of interference.
I have another question, if I may.
Okay.
Gustavo Scotti from Brussels. You are speaking about ships. Do you have a similar experience of interfaces of GPS for aircraft and or for ground system like trucks or like trains?
No, I don't have any experience with data other than ship tracking. So one useful thing that we have been able to do is see that some of these effects can also be seen with fitness trackers on this Strava map. Also, the article that Dana published showing this a similar ring in Tehran in Iran from GPS interference. But I guess so. The so far as far as seeing that this is not just involving ships is the Strava fitness map, but it would be very interesting to see if we have if we're seeing the same thing in other data sources.
Yeah, this is great. So why don't we go ahead and look at the rest of your slides, and then we can take a couple more questions, and then at the end of the meeting, hopefully Bjorn will hang around and answer more questions from the group.
Okay. All right. So we'd identified these locations on the Chinese coast. It's a pretty specific pattern. Rings of high-speed positions, always the same diameter. And this is ongoing in these oil terminals like Dalian. And we're not sure exactly why it's happening. It does mask ship traffic, but we're not sure if that's the objective. But I did start looking at where we may have similar patterns of obviously false AIS position broadcasts from ships. And one quite surprising area, which I identified, is that we also have, what appear to be these orbiting tracks, circles that are concentrated over San Francisco. So here you're seeing several different ships. At this point, it's about a dozen of them that I've found. The main difference from what we had on the Chinese coast is that these ships are not actually near this location. So we have and all of a sudden its track will jump to where it's circling above San Francisco, and it will stay there over several hours or even a few weeks, and then it will jump back to its true location. And going back to the question about how we know, where a vessel really is when we have a false location like this. So how we have been able to track these ships is actually looking at the footprint of the receiving satellite. So the companies that give us the AIS data were able to know which of their satellites actually picked up a position. We also know that AIS is only picked up within something like a 5,000 kilometer diameter footprint on the surface of the Earth. So if we look at the point directly on the Earth, directly below the satellite, and then go out on about a 2,500 kilometer radius, we know that the ship's real location, has to be somewhere within this radius. So in the first example that I found here, I think it's this green track here. It turned out this was a vessel on the coast of Nigeria. So we can see again that here is the San Francisco Bay Area. Strangely enough, all of these circles appear to start around Point Reyes near San Francisco. I'd be very interested if you have any ideas why that might be. What we have is these vessels from different locations that are suddenly popping up above San Francisco for a variable amount of time. So this first example I talked about, this It's actually a crew boat, the Princess Janice, on the Nigerian coast. So this is a boat that goes out from a oil terminal out to various platforms or other vessels off the coast and then back. And we have this, this track circling over San Francisco. And then strangely enough, it also is showing some other movement. And, this false track, again, I don't believe it has any direct relation to the real movements of the boat. It seems to be completely an artifact. We also have it moving out to other spots over the continental US. So again, I'm not sure how that happens. But several other locations, a similar vessel here off the coast of Malaysia. We also have some locations which we know there is have been documented GPS interference. For instance, this vessel, the Hajj Sayed 1 in the Eastern Mediterranean. Also this this Russian boat here in the Sea of Azov. But at this point, this is only something that I'm seeing in AIS. I don't have any collaboration that this is we saw on the Chinese coast. So that's something that I'd be interested in getting more data on, if there's any way that that could be collaborated. Then I have another example here of a vessel on in Bergen, Norway, that also showed up over San Francisco. So at this point, this is completely a mystery as to how this is happening. It might could just be some weird malfunction in the AIS system, or it could be something more significant with GPS manipulation of some sort occurring. Possibly there is, again, a link to operations around oil terminals with some of these boats. So I will be doing some more investigation into this, and hope to publish something relatively soon.
Well, it's really fascinating stuff, and it's interesting that those last sets that you showed us go to all the same part of the world. I mean, it's a mystery generally, but it would be perhaps a little more understandable if they went to different random parts of the world, but it seems to be a pseudo-random kind of thing. So very interesting. And on behalf of everybody, let me thank you for that, and ask if will you be able to stick around to the end of the meeting and answer some more questions?
Yes, I can.
That'd be great. Thanks. So gives us a lot to magic. And by the way, let me thank you because by using Google Docs, you made our member Vint very, very happy. I am unfortunately going to be using a competing project, but I'm sure he's very, very glad, and his heart is warm to see that you did that. So so moving into my part of the presentation, let me just call up my slides, and then, oops, before I do that, I should go back and share my screen here. Sorry, it's technology. There we go. That's the one. Yes, and here we are. So since we last met, the over the last couple years, or last year, probably the biggest thing that has happened to us is that we were endorsed by the George Lucas film franchise. And you may have seen the most recent Star Wars movie, and in it, the Rebel Alliance only succeeds by disabling the evil Empire's navigation system. They almost lose out because the Empire has a second broadcast point, but it's the same system and it has the same vulnerabilities. So the Rebel Alliance is able to take them out and win the day as well. So really good advertisement for our message. On a little bit more serious note, we have had a lot of news in the last 12 months in the GPS space. One of which is that the GPS rollover problem continued on into 2019 with impacts in New York City and specific rollover date in April, but because of the way things were configured in various receivers, there were predictions that it would various users would be having trouble throughout the year, and that certainly took place. We also saw the Galileo navigation satellite system out for 7 days because of a problem with their systems. Very glad to have them back online. And of course, we had a continuation of jamming in virtually every mode of transportation. And this study from DLR continued to get a lot of play. You may recall that they put disruption detectors aboard a container ship, I believe it was, and they found GPS disruption, mostly in ports, a little bit less in coastal traffic, but even out in the deep ocean, they found GPS disruption going on, or GNSS disruption going on, I should say. We also saw at least 2 months of disruption of GPS in the vicinity of Ben Gurion Airport, which services Tel Aviv, generally ascribed to the Russians operating next door in Syria. The Russians certainly were continuing to disrupt in a multi-year program, it seems. GPS reception in northern Norway. Northern Norway, as you'll recall, is particularly susceptible because the terrain has caused them to establish special GPS approaches to most of the airports in northern Norway where they can't have ILSs. And so when these disruptions happen, their air transport is severely impacted. And of course, last year we saw C4ADS build upon the work that we had done the year before and in the Black Sea. And of course, we know it's going on other places in Russia. From AIS, we know about it in the maritime areas, and from Uber and other reports, we know that's happening in Moscow at least, if not in other large cities. And we know, as Bjorn was just talking about, that the Chinese seem to have wanted to do the Russians one better, and that they said, well, the Russians are spoofing all the receivers in one area to one location, to airports. We can spoof all the receivers in an area to random locations, probably not realizing that there's something in their hardware or their software that causes a lot of those receivers to orbit counterclockwise at about 20 to 30 knots, probably around where the spoofing device is. The upper left there is in Shanghai, and the lower right is the one that we recently published about occurring in Tehran. And of course, maybe the most significant is that we found a report of a passenger aircraft that nearly impacted the mountain because of GPS disruption. Unfortunately, this has not had as much impact as any of us might like in terms of preventing further disruption and mishaps, but it has had some impact. One of which is it's contributed to submissions to the International Civil Aviation Organization at the United Nations by multiple groups identifying GPS disruption as an urgent priority. As you recall, we led a group of 14 maritime organizations that petitioned the Coast Guard to bring this up at the International Maritime Organization, another UN body. and they have done a submission to do that as well, although the actual meeting has been postponed because of the. Also, last year you saw one of our members, Regulus Corporation, spoofing a Tesla, and not taking over completely its assisted driving, certainly causing its assisted driving to do things that it would not have done on its own. One of our posts title was something like, "We scared the daylights out of our coworker by spoofing the Tesla he was riding in." We also saw recently the Center for Strategic and International Studies publish their annual space threat assessment. This is a word cloud based on how many times various things were mentioned in that assessment. They don't actually prioritize the risks within the assessment. So we thought maybe we could infer what they thought those risks were by looking at how many times they mentioned different ones. So folks are concerned about these kinds of things, of course, and certainly the Chinese, a very thorough group of folks, are concerned, and they have committed, as announced at the Stanford Symposium last year. You see the nice young lady presenting there in the lower left, that they are committed to a comprehensive system for PNT, using not only satellite navigation, but autonomous things like inertials and clocks, as well as their legacy LORAN and other systems, terrestrial-based systems. We were able to get a hold of a copy. I shouldn't say that. We were able to find a copy when it was pointed out to us on the internet of the Russian CIS navigation. That plan that they are taking a similar approach as the Chinese in terms of emphasizing a resilient architecture of PNT sources rather than relying just on satellite-based. They talk about jamming a lot, probably because they do jamming a lot, and they don't want other people to be able to jam them and have the same kind of impact that they have on others. So here in the United States, a little bit of good news in that we had heard talk of a Department of Defense position navigation timing strategy, and so we asked the Department of Defense for a copy of that. Lo and behold, they edited one down and they gave it to us. The Department of Defense is also talking about a comprehensive PNT architecture centered around GPS, but also with various other layers providing other signals and systems. So that's the good news. The bad news is the strategy also says, you know, we're kind of tired of civilians using GPS because it's limiting our ability to use it as a military tool. So going forward, as we develop these other navigation systems, they're going to be increasingly classified, meaning, of course, that civilians aren't going to have access to them. However, the good news is, I guess we're kind of oscillating back here a little bi-coastal here in terms of optimism and pessimism. Good news is we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Transportation who has become very engaged in PNT issues and committed to a resilient architecture for PNT within the United States that civilians can access. A good aspiration. We are certainly trying to support her actually make that happen. And of course, the White House has recently issued their executive order on responsible PNT use. Mixed feelings about this one because it seems to put all the onus on the user. We're all for responsible use for PNT, I think, but at the same time, you have to have the other resilient sources there to access and to use. And it really doesn't talk about that very much. It hardly talks about it at all. But we can talk more about that later if you like. Overseas, the Europeans have published a radio navigation plan, and they've also contracted for a GNSS interference detection network. That's a follow-on to their fairly extensive Strike 3 study that identified over, I think it's 500,000 instances of GPS or GNSS disruption, about 10% of which they assess as intentional. In a very limited multi-year sampling effort. Over in the UK, and good to have Leon on the call with us. Leon Lobo is heading up the UK government's timing center effort, which is looking to establish virtual timing centers across the country to ensure that the United Kingdom has the kind of timing services when and where all of their critical infrastructure folks need them. We look forward to hearing more about that as we all emerge. I mean, first it was Brexit consuming everything. Now it's the on their side and on our side it was the impeachment. Now it's the COVID. It seems like it's always something. Good to have great people working in the background, nonetheless, on the kinds of things that need to be done to protect us from the next big disaster. Let's hope they get the kind of support and encouragement that they need to be successful. So enough with that editorial, we'll move on. The United States, as you know, has been doing a GPS backup technology demonstration. This is something we worked with Congress and had mandated through the National Defense Authorization Act, and we were able to get $10 million worth of funding to support the Department of Transportation to do. This is their VIP demonstration day that they held in Langley, Virginia, for about half the systems they were looking at. That's Admiral Thad Allen, the chair of the P&T Advisory Board, there on the left. So that's kind of my summary for the big wide world. For our little niche of the RNT Foundation, to update you on things that have happened in the last 12 months. We have a new board of directors who you can find more about on our website and are featured here. I think most of them are with us today. We were also awarded this by the Acquisition International as the best satellite system cyber threat defense organization, kind of a mouthful. You can see more about that on the website. We held our semi-annual reception with the P&T Advisory Board at the Kennedy Space Center in conjunction with the semi-annual P&T Advisory Board meeting. There is some gentlemen from Microchip who helped make the event go, and by funding the catering, and our director on the right. We also put together a little applet that some folks have found kind of interesting, and you can access on our homepage. And if you mouse over any portion of this graphic, there will be a little pop-up that will tell you how GPS is important to each and everything that you see in the picture, even the clouds, because it's a big deal with weather forecasting, and radio occultation is the weather forecasters study the GPS signals as they come through the atmosphere. We were also on CBS Sunday Morning. That's the host of the piece on the right, and that's he and I in our world headquarters, where I'm broadcasting from to you right now. It was a good piece. Again, we have that available on the website, or a link to it available on the website if you would like to look at the whole 8-minute piece, I think it is. Just a little bit disappointed because at the very end, he has a quote from an Air Force general talking about how great GPS 3 is, and saying that it is 8 times more difficult to disrupt than our current GPS. That is true if you are a military user that has M-code equipment, most of which hasn't been built yet, so that doesn't do anything for most of the folks who use GPS. And it's and 8 times a really, really, really low low number is still a pretty low number. So it doesn't do a whole lot, even for the military users. But it did leave the viewers of the segment with the idea that, well, the Air Force might have things under control, and we don't need to worry so much about the case. But it's always good to get on national television, especially with David Pogue, who was the host and was just a really, really nice fellow. And I did follow up with him, by the way, afterwards and tell him, you know, this is what she said and exactly, and this is what it means exactly. And he was a bit surprised, as you can imagine. We also recognized Congressman Peter DeFazio and John Garamendi in the House on the Transportation Committee, and Senators Cruz and Senator Markey in the Senate on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee for their support and eventual passage of the National Timing, Resilience, and Security Act of 2018, which requires the Department of Transportation to establish a terrestrial timing system to back up GPS by December of this year. I am just noticing that I've thoughtlessly cropped out our directors, Jeff Hathaway and Pauline Cook, who were also in the picture, but I will claim that I needed to have more space so you could see the members of Congress more clearly, and I hereby give them my apologies for doing that. Yeah, kind of thoughtless of me.
You are forgiven.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And over the last 2 to 3 weeks, I have been engaged in the very contentious legato issue with FCC. Happy to talk about that offline. If we got started talking about that now, today, it would probably take the rest of the day. Although I certainly would be happy to answer a couple questions about it, but it's a very complex issue, lots of hard feelings on both sides. And Department of Defense side, the Senate Armed Services Committee is having a hearing tomorrow. There will be 3 folks from the Department of Defense and Admiral Thad Allen on the panel talking about the FCC's decision with reference to legato. No representative from the FCC or legato is on the panel, so it tells you how the things are going to be going, but it should give you a good insight into one side of the argument as well. Personally,
that again?
I'm sorry, that's tomorrow. Tomorrow, I forget the time, but it's in our, it's on the Senate Armed Services Committee website, and you can access it. You can get the video by going to their homepage.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. There are 2 sides to every story. I will leave it at that. So, looking at the year going forward for the RNT Foundation, and being mindful of the time, my goodness. Here are the 3 things that I think that we are going to be focusing on. We have the National Timing, Resilience, and Security Act. It needs a bit of money to help the Department of Transportation move forward on that and to encourage the Department of Transportation to do so. So I think that is going to be job 1. Also, our effort to encourage others who are trying to get better receivers out there. I think everybody has appreciation that most of the receivers are reasonably inexpensive, and for some additional money for software, hardware, and antennas, you can get a receiver that's much more resistant to disruption. And then finally, to encourage a number of initiatives that are quite nascent at the moment for monitoring for GPS disruption and disseminating that information. From space, Marty and I have been engaged with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the White House on that. There's lots of information available. It's just a matter of if and how we can get it out there. And then, of course, perhaps getting it down to a sufficiently refined level where folks can take action against those who are accidentally and intentionally disrupting it, at least within the United States. So that is my report. I hope we can all stay together for a little bit and have some questions and answers for the board. And then for Bjorn, it is about 5 minutes before the hour though, so I understand folks' schedules. So with that, I will move swiftly on to the next and last item in the agenda, which is question and answer. So, and let's just mix them all together. If you have anything for the board or for Bjorn, please ask away.
I just had a quick one for Bjorn. And this question comes from somewhat dated experience at the VTS in San Francisco. That's a vessel traffic service. But as I understood it, and it's probably still the case, where AIS is transmitted through very high frequency VHF, which has a limit of what, 10 miles or so. But the question is it possible that the transmission of those signals, the frequency or how it's being done, could be contributing to the circles problem?
Yeah, so I have checked, looking at a couple of different sources of AIS. So there's both AIS that is picked up by terrestrial receivers that are nearby, maybe within, from satellite companies that have satellites that are providing the data. And I'm seeing the same effect from both sources. So it is, yeah, as far as whether somehow the effect might be a result of how this is broadcast over VHF radio, I don't know. We do know that we have the same circles, with AIS on the Chinese coast and this Strava map. So in that case, at least, it's not an artifact from AIS.
So the satellites, they pick it up from VHF also?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right,
Yeah,
great.
they pick up the AIS transmissions directly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey Dana, it's John from John Pottle from the UK. Just may I contribute a comment, which is that I detect that a lot of people are now aware of the potential issues, many of which have been highlighted in this discussion. And I think as a community, there's more we can do to highlight how to undertake a practical risk assessment. And then with that in hand, how to choose some pragmatic steps to harden your system or your application. And we're certainly trying to do more of that in the Royal Institute of Navigation. And if that strikes a chord with you or your board, we'd be very happy to try and share information and ideas on that.
I think that's a great idea, John. I appreciate that. We are always looking for ways to cooperate with the Royal Institute and the U.S. Institute of Navigation, two outstanding organizations. So we'll give everyone on the call a little bit of a preview. Over in the UK, there's a group called NLA, who has recently completed a study for the European Space Agency called Marinav. And the European Space Agency was concerned about GPS disruption and navigation. And so they're looking at ways to do navigation better in various modes. So they asked NLA to look at maritime and how maritime could do better. So they've completed their work, and I've seen a copy of their report. And we're looking at having a webinar by them here towards the middle of the month. So another Zoom event for your consideration, but more to follow on that. So thanks, John. Other questions?
A question for Dana. Dana, do you have any other information on the DOT demos? We know that the first round of those has occurred, but not much detail.
So I do. By coincidence, I just received a a handful of presentations from the Department of Transportation today, which I will be looking over and making available. They are presentations about the different technologies and about the demonstration program, but other than that, since I haven't really looked at them much, I can't tell you. I can tell you that they are putting together their report right now, and they have promised that their report will be both comprehensive and public. So the stage, the sequence is they do the demonstrations, they put together the report, then they go to talk to DHS and DoD and say, if we were to do a backup system, which technology would, and they go forward and execute based on that technology, bidding out for one or more of those technologies. So yeah.
Thank you for the one last thing. I wouldn't want to leave without a word or two about the loss of our good friend and colleague David Platt.
Absolutely. So David was a great personal friend and a great friend of the ION, the RIN, where he was was a past president, and certainly of the RNT Foundation. And in fact, he acted as our representatives in many instances. He would travel to conferences, and we would just need to reimburse his airfare and hotel costs and speak on our behalf, certainly saving us a lot of time and trouble, and being a much better representative than I could be. He is, everyone probably knows, he died in December, several days after I had dinner with him, actually. And it's a great loss to all.
You said it best. Our grieving will not be brief. We had a long collaboration with David, and all good.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Dana, Gene McCall.
Hi, Jane.
Is it possible to get a copy of that DoD PNT report?
Yes, it is on our website. You can look through our blog because we talked about it and we provided a link to it. Okay. I will send you a direct link to where it is.
Okay, I think I can get a classified copy. The problem is it's difficult to find a place to read it nowadays.
Right, and even though I still have my top secret clearance, I try to avoid looking at classified information because if you look at classified, people are going to say, well, you found that out by looking at classified, when in fact, it's like the Tom Clancy problem, right? He wrote a book based entirely on unclassified information about submarines, as William Porter knows. But they tried to haul him off to jail because his research was so thorough that they thought he must have compromised some classified documents. But yeah, no, I'll get that to you.
The idea of the DoD or the Air Force becoming tired of civilians can really have some positive aspects. You say, fine, give the civilians GPS and go build your own.
Well,
or vice versa.
I don't think that would be the first time that suggestion has been offered.
Well,
It might be.
They may be more receptive nowadays.
It might be much less expensive to have reasonably mid-career technologists running GPS than running through the airmen of the day and trying to train them up and keeping a whole battery of folks on staff to do that. But I digress. I'm sorry. I apologize. I tend to editorialize on way too many things. Back to the topic that's at hand, ladies and gentlemen. Anything else? Anything for Bjorn? I think we're all kind of stunned, Bjorn. I mean, you look at those across the world displacements and you go, I mean, that's like the Point Reyes triangle. It's really interesting. So I will mention that that I mentioned to Bjorn that there is happens to be a Coast Guard high frequency radio station right there at Point Reyes, right underneath the center of all of that. I'm confident, reasonably, that has nothing how could anything have anything to do with it? So this is one of those mysteries I think we're all going to look forward to, hopefully seeing it unraveled as we go forward in time.
Yeah, I am really wondering what's point right now. But maybe I'll hear back some ideas after I get this published.
Well, as someone who lived in California for quite a while, I will say there are a number of points of magical harmonic convergence in California, especially in Northern California, up in Marin County there, and that could be part of it too. So.
Well, and certainly there's a lot of vessels that come and go in that area, large ones and small. And any one of those could have something going on with transmitting, interfering, so, or that's causing those circles. So.
Yeah, the mystery. Love it, but good mystery.
Yeah, I mean, the only observation I'd make is that those huge displacements for a GPS or GNSS receiver would upset receivers a lot, I believe, and it may therefore be that it's not an RF effect. That's just my gut feeling, but we can follow up offline. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is possible that it's just a some issue with the AIS system itself, because we haven't seen this with other data types as we did on the coast of China with the Strava maps.
Yeah, I always think back to when we first had AIS. We had a lot of ships reporting they were just west of Central Africa, but that's because they were at 0, right? 0 latitude and 0 longitude. They hadn't bothered to, initialize their equipment, right? So. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. We are always available by email and by Zoom and by phone. So don't be strangers. Don't hesitate to reach out. I think that the inability to move around has given us a lot more flexibility with our time. So please don't hesitate, especially now. And look for our announcement about the webinar on Marinav and future fun events. So thanks again for attending, and thanks very, very much for all your support.
Thank you very much, Dana.
Dana.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.